The initial results from the 2022 primary elections are in. Here's my reaction. Mistakes were made, not all's lost, and what can we learn? Thank you for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is We the Govern. I do want to point out that in Washington State, when we have any kind of elections, election night isn't really a real thing. It's just the initial batch of ballots, and then they continue to count ballots for weeks. We're in the middle of that right now. So as I produce this video, and as you're probably watching it, the likelihood is that things are going to change a bit in the number of ballots that get counted. I hate to have to go into that detail and disclaimer initially, but that's what happens. That's where we live, and that's how mail-in balloting works when you turn election night into election month. But nevertheless, this is where we're at, and let's talk about what came in and what happened with these election results. Well, as a general rule, going back to what I close every video with, and this is definitely an example of what happens when you don't show up, because if you don't show up and you don't vote, you don't matter. And the reality is the turnout was terrible. The initial numbers were really bad, and very few people showed up. A very small percentage of Republicans and a small percentage of Democrats, but it looks like a little bit more of a percentage of Democrats showed up, and therefore some of the election results were not what anybody would expect, especially since in theory we're in the middle of a red wave. And we're certainly in a red wave if you look at the rest of the country. What's different about Washington and what was going on here that kind of makes these results not what we would want? Because after all, let's face it, it's not like people have to go to the polls. Filling this out is not difficult. This is a fairly easy process. Every survey and analysis that's ever been done in recent times in Washington shows that the ability to vote in this state is incredibly easy. The auditors, they will send out multiple ballots to your house. In fact, in King County is a competition to see how many ballots they'll send you out each time. And you have weeks to do your research, to fill it out, to compare notes with anybody else, and then to go drop in the ballot box or in the mail. I do encourage you to do a drop box. Nevertheless, let's look at some of these results. And if you want to compare what I'm saying with what's going on or do some of your own research, go to sos.wa.gov. That's the Washington State Secretary of State website. I encourage you to go there because it actually is really good. Go to the turnout results. It really breaks it down by county, really granularly. You can really get a lot of detail when you go there and learn quite a bit. Even as each additional count as the batches are coming in, as they change, and they're going to change. As of right now, you can see the screen capture I did here. 26% of the voters, the registered voters in the state, have participated so far. A very small number. Might go up as high as 45% when they're finally done. But nevertheless, the majority of people didn't vote. And but it's still worth looking that that's how many people bothered to take the time to actually drop their ballot in the box. So here's a basic overview. Again, as I mentioned, turnout sucked, about 26% right now. Could be as high as 45% when they get the last of the ballots trickling in from whatever random rural locations or odd corners of King County that they might be hidden right now. But nevertheless, that's what we're looking at, and it's not a big turnout. The math doesn't change too much, although later ballots are trending Republican. And in many cases, some very key high-profile races, in fact, Republicans were very effective at tripping themselves up. In fact, they did a masterclass job of showing how you could set yourself on fire and make sure that victory is snatched from the jaws. Just finding ways of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Anyway, the other thing, this is an overall issue I want to really talk about here, about messaging matters, policy and vision matter, and failing to actually properly articulate that is going to be a way to ensure that you underperform. There's just no way to avoid that. So it doesn't matter how angry somebody might be at the political class and the stupid and crazy, incompetent, and corrupt things they might do. It doesn't matter if that person is really frustrated and annoyed with the political process or the results of bad political decisions. And it doesn't even matter if they just think all these incumbent politicians stink and they can't stand them and they don't want to be anywhere around them. It doesn't matter if they don't know and aren't motivated enough to vote for the person who's trying to change what's going on. I know this doesn't seem like much. They have to drive by, drop it off, whether that's a drop box or a mailbox. It is so easy in Washington State, and you got weeks to do it, no problem. But you're only going to change things if you can get people to go out and do that. Take that little step. Take that extra few minutes to do it. If you can't convince them to do that, it won't matter how frustrated, angry, and disappointed they are in the current political class, which in this state in Washington is mostly run by Democrats. And all surveys that have been done recently show that Democrats are in trouble in Washington State. In Washington State, no matter what. But you still have to be able to convince people. And it's not that easy because most people really don't want to talk about politics. They don't want to hear about politics. They don't want to look at politicians, and they certainly don't want to know more about the political process. As much as it affects them in their day-to-day lives, generally most people want to avoid it. They'd rather talk about sports, their family, their career, or even the homeless camp down the street, but they don't really want to talk about politics overall. It's just hard, so you have to break through that. Heck, you have to wake people up from the apathy that most of them are in when it comes to the political process. Nothing new about that. That's always been the way things are when it comes to the political world and the landscape. I mean, there's an ancient quote about you may not be interested in politics, but it's going to be interested in you. And so people don't want to get involved and be involved in that, but you're going to have to wake them up. If you're running for office, you're going to convince people to listen to you even if they don't. It doesn't seem like they want to listen. They will listen if you have a good message. They will pull their hands from their eyes if you have something to show them that's different or interesting or beneficial to them. They will. But it doesn't help if instead of doing that, what you're doing is setting yourself on fire just to impress everybody, or to warm somebody up, or to just, I don't know, show off, or it's partially ego, partially it's just the ignorance, I think, that comes into a lot of new people jumping in the political process, but you're not going to actually make things better if you do that. Now, let's talk specifically about where the Republicans, I think, burned down their own house in the 2022 primary. And it's not everywhere, but there were definitely some high-profile races where opportunities were squandered through incompetence on our side. You can't blame the Democrats. This is entirely a self-created problem. And so when you're burning down your own house, it's still worth stepping back and trying to think, how can we prevent the arson fire from happening next time? And one way of understanding this is just to understand how the top two primary works. We have a jungle primary in Washington State. That means the top two vote getters of all parties that are all thrown into one big race in the primary, only the top two advance. Doesn't matter what party it is. Could be two of the same party, could be two of different parties. I have a video that I have done to explain the history of this in Washington. It's linked down below, but nevertheless, essentially it's a jungle primary. You can look it up. Top two vote getters move on. So what happens? That's a math game. And usually Republicans are better at math, but you wouldn't know it based on how they treated some of these election results and election races. Secretary of State race, most high profile. You had 4 Republicans who decided to jump into the same race. And the problem is that there's a finite amount of Republicans, and even if it's a majority of Republicans are voting in the state and they're concerned about this race, they're splitting the vote when you only have one significant Democrat, the incumbent Hobbs. And in this case, you even had an independent, who's Julie Anderson out of Pierce County, who was running. Now, normally in the top two jungle primary, the independent gets squeezed out every time, but that's presuming that you have kind of a front runner in each party who basically capture each of them more than 33%, and that's what essentially ensures that those two advance. That's the typical result in one of these elections. But if you flood the zone with a bunch of people from the same party, and some of them are fairly capable, so they're pulling chunks of the vote, then they tend to basically cancel each other out. And so you have kind of a fratricide situation where they wipe each other out, which is what looks like it happened currently in this race. You had 3 of these candidates got over or close to 10% or more, and so therefore you're just taking chunks of the potential vote there and you're removing them. And so because of that, it looks like in the general right now that you're going to probably have a Democrat versus an independent and no Republicans in sight on the ballot. This has been done before. It's a mistake when it's happened in the past. It was a mistake this time, and fairly predictable mistake once that zone got flooded with so many Republican candidates. So that's unfortunate. The good news on this race I do want to point out right now is that this was an appointed position when Kim Wyman, after she got elected, decided to immediately join the Biden administration. When she did that, it left an opening. The governor came in and appointed a Democrat, Hobbs, who's in there now. And the reality is now, so you're required then to run the next general election cycle, which is this one. But then this race is going to come up again in 2 years. So hopefully, if the Republicans want to regain a seat, they've learned some lessons from what they just did to themselves. And there's an opportunity in the future, assuming they can get their act together. Another interesting analysis, and we talked about this ahead of time with the video, but there were 2 unpopular Republican congressmen in our state, mainly because they had voted to impeach Trump. And so with the base, they had lost a lot of support. One of them was Representative Newhouse in the 4th Congressional District, middle of Washington. One of them was Jamie Herrera Butler, which is actually my district, so the Southwest Washington. And both of them were very unpopular. And the election results that just happened, the primary results so far, clearly show that they're unpopular. Representative, my congresswoman, she got 23% right now of the vote. That's not great for an incumbent in a top 2 jungle primary. That's a terrible number. And Newhouse got about 27% so far in the 4th congressional district. So neither one of them are terribly popular with their base, but the Republicans, again, in typical fashion, flooded the zone in both of these races with multiple candidates who all took enough votes from each other to ensure that their stated goal of removing the incumbent, who they didn't like, won't happen, and that both of the incumbents in these cases are going to move forward, despite the clear unpopularity that they're suffering amongst their base in their districts. Now, if there's a single candidate running against them in 2 years, I think they're both in trouble if you got a really capable candidate. Nevertheless, that's what's happened, and it was a lot of money, a lot of resources, millions of dollars between these 2 races that were spent for no change in the status quo, essentially. And the only question in the 3rd congressional district is if Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler is so wounded in this fight that she's not able to beat the Democrat. I don't know. It is a Republican-leaning district, but that's always a potential scenario, and we'll see how November treats that race. The other race that kind of was similar this way that happened, and this is more on the legislative side, was up in Kent, Washington, the 47th Leg District. This is a district where, and this is both House seats and the Senate seat in that district were up for election this cycle, and all the surveys showed that this district has swung dramatically more Republican-friendly. And in fact, 2 of the Democrat incumbents, Democrat Senator Mona Das and the Democrat legislator in that district, they retired. They didn't even want to run again. So 2 of the seats were open entirely. And unfortunately, in one of the seats, the Republicans decided to flood the zone with 3 candidates. And again, they kind of did the same thing. There were 2 Democrat candidates in that race because it's an open seat. So you had multiple Democrat candidates and multiple Republican candidates. And unfortunately, on a seat that is likely a Republican win, if you had a Republican on the general ballot, it's very close still, but it looks at this point in time, the Republicans are getting late ballots. So I'm hoping that I'm wrong, but at this point in time, it looks like 3 Republicans have kind of canceled each other out. And you would think that maybe somewhere along the way, at least one of them might have changed their mind so that there was at least a chance, in fact, almost guaranteed that, and one Republican would come through. But that's not what happened, and 3 of them ran against each other, and it doesn't look good at this point in time. These are mistakes, they're forced errors, they don't have to be that way, but that's what happened, or it appears to have happened so far. Now let's talk about some of the races where damage has been done, could be better, null's not lost, and there's some things that can be changed, and it's worth reviewing these situations as well. The 8th Congressional District is not so much damage done, but it's an example of you had 4 Republican candidates who were throwing some money into that race and running serious campaigns. And one of them, Reagan Dunn from the King County Council, and Jesse Jensen, who had run for that seat 2 years ago and did really, really well, got very close. Really, based on the polling, looked like both of them were probably the front runners. And Jesse Jensen ran a pretty negative campaign over the last couple months attacking Reagan Dunn. It did hurt Reagan Dunn, but it blew back on Jesse Jensen too. And again, I'm not judging. Mostly, I know all the guys, all the candidates here. I know them all, and I've worked with all of them in one capacity or another in the past. So I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. I'm just pointing out what happened. That attack and that fight, intramural fight that happened, I think it hurt both candidates. And in dropping both those candidates' numbers, it shifted more people towards Matt Larkin, who had done a really good job bringing in a bunch of money towards the end of the race and ran, actually, I thought, some pretty good ad campaigns, both on TV and radio. The establishment tended to mock Larkin for some of these ads, but I thought they were actually pretty good, and they communicated and played well in the district. And it looks like he's coming out ahead, and he'll be the Republican to challenge Kim Schreier, who's the Democrat incumbent in that district. And I will point out that Kim Schreier's numbers look bad. So as the incumbent congresswoman, she looks like she's super vulnerable. It's recognized nationally as being one of the seats that can flip in the state, and that's still consistent with the way these primary results came out. It just looks like counter to establishment wisdom going into this. It looks like Matt Larkin will be the candidate. I will point out that Matt Larkin did win this district when he ran a couple years ago for Attorney General against Bob Ferguson, who arguably is a much stronger name recognition and a stronger candidate than Kim Schreier in Congress. So really the numbers do look good for Matt Larkin going into the general, and his fundraising really improved quite a bit as he went through. So if that momentum can be maintained, that's good. So it's not necessarily bad, but it's an example of four people battling it out, and one of them was going to come through. There was only one Democrat, fortunately, so that they didn't run into a situation that we described earlier with some of these other races. But it really showed how sometimes these intramural negative fights don't necessarily do well for your own side, and it didn't work out too well for the two people involved in that. The other one where there was a pretty nasty intramural fight Republican-wise is up in the 39th Ledge District, which is up in kind of Snohomish County, Skagit County area. And you had incumbent Representative Sutherland, who had stepped on the toes of a number of establishment people. Yeah, he's made some mistakes here and there, but generally a solidly conservative vote in the legislature. And the annoyance, I think, that he caused for the establishment convinced them to recruit Sam Lowe, who I'd supported when he ran for the Snohomish County Council. I think he's done a pretty good job there as councilman, but it pitted the two Republicans against each other in a pretty aggressive campaign. Sutherland looks like he's leading. What's interesting about that race, though, is that right now it looks like both Republicans do make it through to the general. I thought one of the Democrats might sneak up and be able to get in, but it doesn't look like that's the case right now. We'll see. And if the two Republicans come in, it's just going to be a nasty, bruising fight all the way to the bitter end in November. And that's usually not the race result that most Republicans would necessarily want for a race like that. Now, we'll point out there's about 12 Republicans that underperformed across the state compared to what all the analysis and polling and data looked like they would do. And again, the red wave isn't just going to happen on its own. It's going to take some people to get out there and message well and justify voter support and why they should come out and vote for them. There's always excuses that consultants have. They come out of the woodwork with these in the past. But there's no reason for Washington to literally be the only state in America that the red wave for some reason doesn't affect, especially when the Democrats in Washington state have put on a great show demonstrating how incompetence and total idiocy in political leadership can produce just terrible results that nobody can ignore. And so if you can present a reasonable, rational, normal, sane message on the other side and a good reason for people to come out and vote for you, there should be great opportunities there. But again, this leads into what I think is my big recommendation and suggestion for this video and for future candidates, whoever's going to actually pay attention to this. You've got to have a vision for people to come out and vote for you, and for whatever reason. And I don't get this, because a lot of Republican candidates in the state legislature now have told me the same thing, that the general approach by consultants has been to tell them just to focus on resume and not on any policy suggestions or changes or differences that they want to offer. I think that's a mistake. The Democrats do tend to vote based on party ID. I'm gay, therefore you must vote for me, right? Or I'm transgender, or I'm the right race, or I've checked some intersectionality box off. And that identity, those identity politics, that is how the left tends to run. That isn't how people on the freedom and liberty side of the political equation are going to be successful. It doesn't hurt if you have a good resume and you have something interesting in your background. I think that helps fit a good story of why you're running, but you got to have a specific policy set of suggestions that make sense, that people can say, that's something I support. And if you don't do that, I don't think you're going to do well. And we should know there's been an ample opportunity for lots of good ideas. The crime wave in Washington state is just, nobody in this generation has seen the rapid change of crime, violent crime, property crime, all kinds of crime, just spiraling out of control, especially in the urban Puget Sound area, but also in eastern Washington cities, really all across the state. There's been a massive uptick in crime. Part of it's due to drug addiction, part of it's due to homelessness, which is really tied into drug addiction as well. But this general lawlessness that's just spreading everywhere very quickly, very dramatically, when that's happening, that gives people something to talk about on why they don't want those same policies. Candidates should have something to talk about. Additionally, from a national level, and this affects everybody in our state just as well as it does everywhere else, the cost of living, inflation for food, inflation when it comes to the cost of fuel, all these things are impacting us as well and everybody in our community. And it doesn't matter what your political persuasion might be. The reality is you're paying a lot more for the basics, and that tends to change how you think about the political process process and the people who are in charge, who seem to be just happy with where it's going. If you want that to change and you don't want them continuing to take your money and set it on fire, squandered on foolish stupidity, then you're going to want to change the political process. And as a candidate running, you have lots to talk about, a lot of things you can do to make a difference. Freedom's important. I'm a freedom and liberty guy. That's what I like to promote everywhere I go. And you have to have candidates able to articulate why that's a good, important thing for them too. You have to have them articulate that, yes, change is needed, but why are you going to be part of the change? That's important. You got to have that out there. If you don't have that message and it's just about what a great resume you have, I don't think it's going to work to motivate somebody like this to get off the couch and actually get a pen to paper and fill out that ballot. You're just not going to have them do it. They're going to sit back and complain, maybe, get angry, be upset, not like how things are going, but they're not going to be motivated to vote. You got to motivate them to vote. A vision and a message, I think, is the only way to do that. And don't make don't turn into a treasure hunt and a secret sauce kind of effort for somebody to figure out what you believe and how you stand on the issues. That doesn't make any sense to me. And yet, again, as a general consultant behavior, that just seems like a really bad idea. And if they're telling the candidates, as many of these candidates are telling me, that they've been kind of directed to go in that direction, it just doesn't make any sense. Don't make it hard. Make it easy. Make it easy for people to vote for you, not hard. So we will get into a lot more details in the breakdown, both in some of the local elections, which are really interesting, that are going on around the state. So many of these ballots are still coming in, so I know there's some things that could shift, especially in some of the close races. The trend has generally been Republicans bringing in the ballots right at the very end lately, so these late ballots seem to be trending Republican, but nevertheless, I don't expect huge changes, but there are going to be a few that could happen, so I'd rather do an analysis after we actually get all the ballots in a week or two and can talk about something at that point. So if you like what you see here, please feel free to subscribe down below. Feel free to share with others. Let me know where you think I'm wrong in the comment section below. Try to read all the comments. I will respond to as many of them as I can. Tell me where I'm wrong. I'm always happy to hear about that. And just don't forget, as I mentioned in the beginning, and as not enough people did, probably everybody watching this video, but not enough people did, the future belongs to those who show up, so make sure you show up.